Okay, given it's 1 minute past, we'll make a start. So hi everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, focused on supplier capacity, supplier envelopes governed by the de minimis submission rules as set out in the migration framework. Before we make a start, I'm just going to take us through some housekeeping. So Rowan, if you wouldn't mind just moving on to the next slide, please. So in the normal fashion, please do use Slido to ask any questions that you have throughout the duration of the webinar. You can join at slido.com by entering the hashtag migration plans passcode. Now, we recognise that some of your questions may be quite technical given the topic that we're discussing this afternoon. So if it's difficult for you to type your question into Slido, please do feel free to use the raise hand function as an alternative to ask your question, and we will come to you as soon as we can and pick that up. So for this webinar, we've dedicated approximately 20 minutes to a Q&A at the end of the session, but we will look to take any questions as we go as well. And any questions not answered, obviously we'll do our best to answer as many as we can during the webinar. But if there are any questions that we don't get round to answering, we will pick those up in a follow-up FAQ document, which will be uploaded to both the collaboration base and the website for you all to access. And just to flag that the session is being recorded, and we will aim to publish the recording along with the slides in this week's issue of The Clock that will go out to participants tomorrow. So if we just move on to the agenda. So the agenda for this afternoon's webinar is to initially kick things off with a brief introduction, which will be led by my colleague Ian. Ian will then hand over to Alf, who will take us through a worked example with the intention to help you understand your envelope and also to provide you with some guidance on how to complete the migration plan submission, which will be submitted to the Migration Control Centre, so the MCC. And as I've said, we've set aside time at the end for a dedicated Q&A before we finish up. So I will hand over to my colleague Ian to give a bit of an introduction.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Fran, for the introduction. Thanks for joining the call today. I'm going to try and keep this as brief as I possibly can, because I think there's probably a lot more value in getting onto the next section, where Alf will be leading you through the material that we've sent out with regard to the templates that to enable submissions to be completed. But essentially, this is the second webinar that we've gone through. Yesterday's was to deal with those submissions that are bounded by capacity envelopes. That's where portfolios are greater than 35,000 within an LDSO for a supplier. So today we'll be dealing with the specific nuance about how those submissions are to be completed where a supplier's portfolio within an LDSO is less than 35,000 or exists within a de minimis LDSO. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alf so we can get into the meat of this. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Ian. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen now, and a lot of you that attended the presentation yesterday will probably see there's a little bit of overlap because it is very similar. So what I'll try and do is probably go a little bit quicker through the stuff that we covered in regards to the envelope bound submissions rather than the de minimis rules, and then focus on the de minimis rules. I'll just check everybody can see the screen. Okay.
Yeah, we can see that, Alf.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is first, before I get into the actual submission, an example of the submissions of which I've got a few different scenarios to help bring that into live. One moment. So this is a summary of all the various different suppliers that I'll be using in this particular example, the walkthrough today. So I'll have a SIT supplier, supplier A, and they have a migration start date planned or targeted for the 7th of April. And that particular SIT supplier has, as we can see, based on their envelope, several supply MPIDs that are contained within that are being aggregated up. And for simplicity, I'm included the portfolio shares of each of those supply MPIDs and the total portfolio share of that envelope MPID. So we can see that's the aggregation. And we can see in this particular example, this supplier has a very only activity in 4 LDSOs for this particular supplier MPID, which obviously shows it's got a different type of business. And this just shows as an example of sort of how we've aggregated those envelopes up. For the de minimis supplier, for today's one, we've got a SIT de minimis supplier as well as one start in October to show those two different start tranches and how they may differ. And for this example, the de minimis supplier, as we can see here, has got 3 MPIDs with that kind of distribution, 66,000 MPIDs in total, with 60,000, 1,000, and a very small presence in that one. So that's really sort of the portfolios we're looking at. So now I can, without further ado, open up the de minimis supplier for tranche A that's starting, as I say, on the 7th of April next year. And as Ian showed you in that first folder, what you received is a zip file that looks somewhat like this. It has a manifest that describes all the contents, a submission template folder, which is the call to action that we require you to fill in. Equally, there's a document that we provided, a submission guide that actually describes all the columns and properties in there if you need to refer to that, and also points out which columns are mandatory for you to fill in and which ones are conditional based on certain rules, or indeed optional. There's also an info folder which we have provided you with some supporting information to help you understand your submissions further. And time permitting, we can go through this in a little bit more detail, but in summary, we have what we provided you with today is a weekly envelope, and it's actually based on this base data here, which is the daily calculations for your envelopes. And we go through sort of various different scaling factors, etc., the actual calendar that we're using, and some lookup values there as well. So next into the submission template. So the first thing, as same as yesterday, where we'd like you to start is looking at sheet C, which is the overview of that envelope, similar to that spreadsheet I showed you before, but this is what we send out, and it's unformatted. And here we can see for ADM1, the envelope MPID that we've aggregated under, because it's actually the largest presence that we've seen here. So we've chosen that one. Obviously, if you feel that you've got a different target MPID that you'd like for us to aggregate under, just let us know when you return your submission. But for this particular example, we're aggregating under ADM1. And for this one, we've got 66,000, as we said before. And as I scroll across, we would actually have provided, because it's a SIT supplier, there is no PQS submission, so we haven't captured those PQS target dates. For the de minimis supplier that starts in October, we shall see that those dates are populated, and that's the information we've got from PQS that we provided in here. And also, furthermore, if you've indicated if that supplier MPID is retiring. So even if that's the case, we understand that there may be some a portfolio, a number of MPANs still against those retiring MPIDs that do need to be shuffled across prior to migration or even during migration. And then from our data that we have, we'll have a view of what that sort of parent company or that group name for that entity, of that collection of MPIDs, and then the actual supplier names for each one of those, because there may be sort of individual entities that are actually assigned to each of those supplier MPIDs. And furthermore, as I said, when we look at the October example, we'll see qualification waiver preferences provided. And the call to action here is just the final column, which is if you perceive that there's any changes or anything that's variations to this data that we've provided at this level, just say there's an update and the comment as to why that update is required. And so one of the examples could be that you would prefer a different envelope MPID to be used because that's more like your target MPID, or equally for some reason there's a gross area, serious deviation from the meter point counts. For clarity, we took the cut of data as of the beginning of June this year from our ES snapshot, and that's how we've derived these portfolio sizes. And we will, on a regular basis, when we issue the next set of envelopes and submission templates, we'll be providing an update that will be updated on the latest values that we can get available from ES to drive that. And that will reflect any churn as well, of course. So any questions, Fran, before I'm opening up sheet B?
Yes, we've got a couple of questions actually that have come through to Slido. So there's a question from Colin, and Colin has asked, does an MPID need to be included if it has no MPANs registered to it?
It depends is the short answer. So if there's no MPANs and it's retiring and you don't expect any activity on it, then yes, it doesn't need to be included. And let me just go back to that example here. And it's really for completeness that we've included all the portfolio. So in some of the templates we provided, you may see a 0 against any of these, but it's because we don't actually have the information down to that level, or what suppliers actually intend to do may not be captured. So we've tried to assume as little as possible, but that's where you can provide us information that supplier MPID is genuinely going to be demised and not going to be qualified, and there's going to be no activity on it, and then we can clean up our data to reflect that position. So hopefully that answers your question, Colin.
Perfect, thanks, Alf. And then Sarah's flagged that she's received a version of sheet C, but it doesn't have all the fields as shown on your screen now. So will there be a new version coming out?
So in this one, you're absolutely right. Well spotted, Sarah. I didn't mean to call it out. Apologies. I did notice on yesterday's presentation, these two values would have been useful on this particular template, and I've added these in, which are the portfolio accounts. It's just for clarity. You can derive it from the sheet B yourselves by aggregating it up, but this is just effectively you can derive it from that for the moment. For the next, we're not going to issue it again now because just the sheer volume, but what we will do is we will add it to the next version and update the guide accordingly.
Great, thanks, Alf. That's all the questions in Slido for now.
Thank you. So moving on to sheet B. So as I said before, this is the LDSO level meter point counts, and furthermore, this has some additional information. And again, what we would seek you to do, and there may actually be no submission in a lot of these cases if you see nothing untoward in them and actually you agree with all the information in there. So what we'd all really just ask you to do, say that there's no submission for template C and no submission for template C. As you see, there's no comment to be made. So, and then it would just be, say, for instance, template A, the weekly submission where you are required to give information in that, and the guidance does reflect that. So for this one, as I said before, this has actually got the meter point counts at an LDSO level for the actual envelope MPID. So it doesn't show the supply MPIDs, but it does. You can derive the aggregate value for all the total envelope value for the envelope MPID from this one. So that's what we can see here. So for this particular supplier, they have so this one I think is so what we have to do is just ignore this value. This is just a corruption in the data, this one. So we just filter that out. So what we can see here is the for this particular LDSO, this envelope MPID has this many MPANs, and because it's a de minimis supply, we have these flags, and these are booleans, true or false. And so the first one here is, as Ian described, has this portfolio, is it de minimis portfolio within this LDSO? So therefore the total, the number of MPANs within, or the meter points within this LDSO, is less than 35,000 trading, that is. So therefore that would be flagged as true. There's a flag here that shows it could be a de minimis LDSO portfolio. That means in total, all the meter points for that LDSO that are trading is less than 150,000, and that's based on our current parameter set that we have. So if either of these are true, we would class that supplier's envelope, that presence, as a de minimis supplier. If both of them are false, it's not a de minimis portfolio and it's not a de minimis LDSO, then you will be getting an envelope. So as we can see here, there's none here that have got false, which would indicate that this supplier is getting an envelope for this particular portfolio, and all of these are relatively small. Now that's kind of at a sort of a high level to determine here's all the LDSOs that this supplier has a presence in that will that fall under the de minimis submission rules. Are there any questions, Fran, before I move on to the weekly submission template?
No questions, Alf.
Okay. So moving on to the weekly submission template. So now this has a time dimension effectively added to the data that we've seen before, and it's a weekly granularity as we've already stated. So the first one is the LDSO envelope key, which is just a composite key of these two values. We need this so for when we actually ingest the data back into our system. So I'll just hide that now. So for this given supplier with that envelope MPID and the ELC, we have a number of weeks, and we could see these week IDs are ordinal, starting with week 15, and that's from the beginning of the year. And the last part is the sprint identifier. So we can go through, and if I scroll all the way down for Eastern, what I can see when we get to it, there we go. That's all of the weeks that's required for Eastern, and then there's 87 because it's a SIT supplier that's going to be active for the whole of the migration period. So that's why we can see all the weeks are there. And then it starts again from the first week that the supplier has indicated, because we actually have in our reference data that it's starting on the 7th of April. So that's the next LDSO, and you'd follow it down from that point of view. So going back to the top, here's the column which is effectively the one that derives that from as I showed you before, is it a de minimis LDSO, or is the envelope a de minimis envelope for that envelope MPID in terms of the total number of trading MPANs for that LDSO that supplier has. And this these two are here again booleans, so it either follows the envelope rules, which means that we would have given you a value in column M, M here, that would be greater than 0, and that would indicate that that's the constraint that you're bounded by to complete this template. However, if this is a 1 in here, this means that you're following the de minimis submission rules, which we'll be talking about today. So for the de minimis submission rules, we can see there's a 1 in all here because we're talking about that today. There's a number of migration days that need to be considered that you would spread your, you need to consider that that's the total aggregate for your submission. So that will be totaled up. So for instance, in this example, there's 4 migration days. So if I wanted to, we'll go through this next, that'll become important in a moment. And if I go here, there's a supplier ramp up, and this is relevant to the supplier starting in October because they will actually have some days where they're scaled down at a smaller level at the beginning to factor in that supplier ramp up period while pipe cleaning undertaking. For a SIT de minimis supplier, there is again a constraint while we're going through early life support, and there's still conversations to be had how we'll be organizing that and what the submission constraints will look like. And the column J is the count of core migration window days. And what do we mean by a core migration window day? The core migration is the period at which we will provide you a full capacity within the constraints and as defined in the foundations document are available to you for that period, and that's where we would expect suppliers to undertake the most of their migration. 90% is what we're asking for during that period, and that helps us to safeguard the M15 date and left shift the migration process so we can ensure that those participants coming on later have sufficient capacity, because see that there's a number of reasons for that we discussed in various working groups. Here are the beginning and end dates for this particular week ID, and then as a de minimis supplier, I can see that I've got a 0 value here for an envelope rather than a value as it were if I actually had been given, if it was an envelope provided by the Migration Control Center. So what I would have to then do is reflect back on the de minimis submission rules as they are documented in the guide, and I should be able to talk to that. Maybe I'll just ask Ian to step in here and just talk through the actual de minimis submission rules.
No worries, Alf. So, and I suppose a little bit of context here. During the course of the working groups, when we were working through the approach of deriving capacity envelopes to bound parties' plans submissions, it became very apparent that when the portfolio shares within individual LDSOs dropped below a certain point, the capacity envelopes actually looked very small, and it was wholly illogical to actually use that as a mechanism to smear very small values over a very long period of time. So we took an approach through the working group whereby we lessened the constraints on these de minimis portfolios. So just to go, and this will be in section 4 of the submission guide in terms of the rules that need to be applied. So there's for both non-SIT and SIT suppliers, there's a consideration of ramp up. So so if you've got a de minimis portfolio that's part of SIT, then we will ask you to submit in line with the proportion that the capacity envelopes need to be due, i.e. 10%. So we would ask to see 10% of your portfolio apportioned during the early life support window, which is articulated as Alf has previously previously described. If you're a non-SIT supplier, we're asking you to bound your submission within your first calendar month following migration to between 5 and 10% of your portfolio. So this is analogous to the industry ramp up and the individual supplier ramp up periods that we see where envelopes are issued. In order to prevent sort of extreme spikes of data with parties wishing to sort of migrate their whole portfolio within a day, we're seeking to kind of smear that submission out. So what we're asking for is that the remaining portfolio must be migrated using no less than 20 days, and we're not mandating which days those are. They can be days of your choosing. We've as part of this exercise, we collected a number of, I guess, preferences from suppliers about how they may wish to organise this due to internal business concerns. So we're not seeking to sort of mandate which days those are, other than that we'd like it that it was more than 20. The other constraint, moving on to in terms of the maximum daily submission, we would ask that does not exceed 10% of the LDSO's threshold. So in the material that we've distributed and within the thresholds document, the daily migration thresholds are articulated for the LDSO. So what we're asking for is that within an LDSO, we ask you not to exceed 10% of that value. And the final point is that we're aware of some of the much smaller portfolios and what we're saying is that if you have 500 or less MPANs within an individual LDSO, you're effectively free to schedule these as you see fit. So where we're seeing these weekly submissions, you could place that however you chose. Where it's less than 500, we're not seeking to apply the 20-day rule and so on and so forth. It really is a free submission. I'm going to pause there for any questions, I think.
There are no questions in Slido, Ian.
Okay, fabulous. Thanks very much. Okay, in which case, unless there's anything you haven't covered there, Alf, I think I can probably hand back to you.
Okay, thank you. So now it's kind of working through a worked example. So here, obviously, in this one, and this data isn't available, but I said I can derive it. This is the total number of the meter point counts that are trading for this particular supplier. And as I said, I can actually, if I can show that for the one we've provided on this one. Oops. So the total sum for this one, so that's the meter point counts. And if I was to put a total on that, just one moment. I can see that's the actual total number of MPANs that can be derived from this particular sheet. So now I can see that's 666,039. So then, based on Ian's rules, as he just stated, over the next 30 days of that submission, going back to this sheet, so during this early life period, I can submit up to 10% of that portfolio for a given day. That's correct, isn't it, Ian?
That is correct. It's at remember that everything is at the LDSO level. So where we're managing it's important to sort of reinforce that a submission will be
at the LDSO level,
created for each LDSO. So where we're looking at portfolios, it's always at the LDSO level. So if you can expand that out for me, so where on the, if we can show an example of where of the portfolio sizes from the previous sheet, if that's okay, Alf.
Yes, so I need to understand what is the portfolio size for ELC from the previous sheet.
Yeah.
So that's sheet B. So what I can see here is let's do And there we go. So there's the portfolio size for ELC, and I can see that's 6,562, and 10% of that is going to be 656. So that's the maximum that this supplier can submit for that particular day.
Yeah, and it's also it's also with the constraint within the either the early life support period or the first calendar month following migration start if you're a non-SIT supplier. So if you're a non-SIT supplier and you've got, in this example, you've got 6,000, 6562 MPANs within your portfolio, within the LDSO, within the first month, you would only as a maximum you would only submit 656. So it's a cap on that first month period.
So it becomes a cap. So if I was to fill in this example, for that first month, actually it's slightly different for this one. So this is an early life example. So these are all the these are the industry ramp up period, which is actually 3 months in total. And we've got to work out what that would look like. So we've still got to determine these caps, haven't we, Ian?
Yeah, but for the moment, we're asking that the same applies. So we're asking that you schedule between 5 and 10% of your portfolio within the early life support period if you're a SIT supplier. So it's the same volume as if regardless of whether you're considering the early life support period or if it's a post-SIT supplier ramp up period, and the reason for that is that we understand that there are still conversations underway about the precise profiling of how early life support is going to be managed. So we're maintaining equivalence for those for the time being.
Yeah, so that's the whole period, I think we're saying, isn't it? So for the whole 3 months, that's going to be no more than 656. Yeah. So for this example, if I was just to pull that down, that results, so that's that period there. And I can see that I've got 650 for that whole period at 50 submissions per day. So that's what that rolls out to if I'm going to make that a level submission for that whole period. So that would be a valid submission because it's less than 10% of the portfolio for that period. Then once we've exited early life and effectively it becomes the less constrained period, in terms of that total portfolio, what can be submitted that becomes a daily submission. Is it 60 to 56 in total, isn't it, Ian?
Correct, yep.
So in fact, that supplier can say, I'm going to go open up the taps fully, and it goes, that's my full capacity now, and I can run that to then, this is really ambitious as well. Actually, this is daily value. I have to add it up, don't I?
We do need to just clarify one point though, because the 10, so the threshold value that constrains the daily value at this point is actually a function of the LDSO's threshold. So if you're considering a large LDSO, their threshold value will be 40,000. So the value that we would ask not to be exceeded would be 4,000 in that case, rather than 10% of your own portfolio. It's 10% of the LDSO's threshold, just for clarity.
Yeah. So there's so the LDSO threshold becomes an important factor. So what I could probably do is for ELC, let's find the LDSO threshold. So the LDSO threshold for that would be actually as part of the information that we've provided. So in the info, we can see here the info D LDSO. And if I open that up, what I can see is for Eastern, I've got 40,000. So therefore, 10% of that 40,000 is the upper bound during that full operating period for a de minimis supplier that they can submit on a given day. That's correct, isn't it, Ian? I think it is. So
Sorry, yes, it is.
Yeah.
was
So in this
confused.
example, as we understood, this supplier has already migrated 650 meter points at this point, and they're probably going to only have whatever it is, 6,000 left. So in effect, and that's for this week. If I'm looking at this week, I can see there's 3 migration days. So out of those, if I'm going to do a weekly aggregate, I can actually effectively say they want to migrate, say, 1,000 meter points per day. So that would then result in 3,000 for that week. And then for the remaining week, there's probably another, just doing a rough calculation, another 3,000 remaining. And they could choose to spread that over a couple of weeks. So if they want to reduce that down to, say, slow down as a sort of a runoff, because they're sort of complex scenarios, and that could be later on, because that's kind of the more straightforward ones. These would then become 0 submissions for a little while they deal with the outturn or whatever. And then later on during the migration, they say, actually, we'll have another 500 because they're more difficult. And that could be spread over the week. And if we look at this week here, there's 5 migration days. So that could be 100 a day, for example, or it could be 200, 250 over 2 days in reality, but we're only planning at a weekly granularity. We're not really we don't require that detail at this point, because it's really, we're looking at the feasibility across all submissions.
And
at this level.
Yeah, and just to jump in here, I mean, this was consciously built in, this kind of flexibility, noting some of the constraints that parties brought to the working groups in terms of wanting to be able to migrate, all of the MPANs associated to a particular customer at a point in time, or the ability to align the migration of meter points for a particular customer to a particular day. So we're seeking to allow that level of flexibility, and I guess probably one important point to raise is that what underpins the flexibility is that when you consider the total share of the portfolio of the portfolios that are in this de minimis threshold, it's actually quite low when you consider the macro level of MPANs that needed to be migrated. So we believe that flexibility exists.
Yeah.
Sorry to pipe up there off, but I just thought it was
no, it's just useful. And as you can see, it is extremely flexible. So then I can say, actually, nothing's going to happen for a little while, for a period, because I'm still in Eastern at the moment, just for clarity, to show that. And then what I might do, just to make this a little bit easier, I'll just turn this into a table. I filter on. Eastern. Oh, sorry, I didn't make the table for the whole thing. That's why. Give me a moment.
I think I'll probably take this opportunity just to pick up a couple of questions that have come up on the Slido. So I think, Colin, you've raised the question: how does the migration plan take account of portfolio churn? So this plan will iterate, and obviously there'll be a number of iterations before migration actually gets underway. And once we start migrating, the framework has this concept of having 2 monthly sprints. So every 2 months we will be taking fresh views of portfolio snapshots, and what we will be doing is comparing those snapshots, generating new envelopes where required. We will pass the same material that we've passed out previously ahead of every sprint, allowing you to reforecast if there is portfolio churn, because in the first instance it governs what the capacity envelopes look like, which isn't material for this, but what it does do is allow for submissions to be revised if there is portfolio churn. So I just wanted to pick that point up. I think there's a question from Ray: is the 10% per day or for the overall period? I'm assuming this is referring to the 10% of the LDSO threshold. Now that constraint exists for any day that you wish to choose to migrate, I guess. So the only constraint we're seeking is that that on a given day that your submission doesn't exceed that value, regardless of how many days you're submitting. I hope that answers that question. Apologies if I've misinterpreted that.
I suppose, yeah, just for clarity, what maybe understand it. Here's the industry, the early life support period. So this has a different constraint, as we spoke to before, which is you can't migrate more than 10% of your portfolio for that entire period. So as we showed here, that adds up to 650, and 10% of this supplier's portfolio and the LDSO is 6,560 odd. And then once we open up and we go beyond that, this actual early life support period where the constraint exists, it then opens up. And instead of being a 10% of the supplier portfolio within LDSO, it's 10% of the LDSO total portfolio, which I showed was in the info sheet D. So in info sheet D, that tells me that, sorry, it's not the supplier portfolio, it's the supplier, sorry, the LDSO threshold, not the portfolio, didn't you say, Ian? Which is 40,000. So it's 10% of the threshold for the LDSO.
Thanks, Alf.
Yep. So hopefully that makes sense. I know there's kind of a lot of concepts, and there's probably some things we can do with this template. Like, for instance, we could put some of those numbers on this spreadsheet to reduce the amount of friction and cross-referencing upon reflection. So obviously those kinds of improvements we can put in to make it more easy, more straightforward for the de minimis suppliers to reduce the amount of cross-referencing. But we tried to keep this simple, not have too much data on it.
We've just had a question in, Alf and Ian, from Neil. So Neil's asked, with respect to portfolio churn, how much churn requires the resubmission of a schedule?
So at the moment, what we're asking for is that all submissions actually cover the full extent of the portfolio. I think we were asked a similar question yesterday, actually, in the envelope session. I think we will take this away and give it some consideration, actually, because if it's a very small number, we are probably not going to be too worried about a resubmission. So we'll probably take that away as a separate point, I think, and it only becomes material, I think, when we get around to the next submission anyway. But you know, if it's 5 MPANs different, we're probably not going to be too worried. If it's 20% of the portfolio, we probably will be. So we'll take that away, but we note the point.
Yep.
Thanks, Ian. That's all the questions at the moment, Alf.
Thanks, Fran. So just to complete this particular example out, we can see here that this supplier has filled in a total of 4,150. And obviously there's, well, I think it's to get to 6,000 and whatever it was, and 56,560. We need to add a few more on. So that's going to be, for this given week, I'd say there's probably another 1,000 here. And then obviously a 0 submission. Well, downstream processing again, but remember, this is just the weekly aggregate, just to confirm that. And there's the count migration days is 5. So this could be, as I said before, that could be 200 per day over 5 days, if you so choose. Or something like 333 over 3 days. That's for your internal planning. And then, as I can see now, there's 500 and 150, so there's about 1,500 left. So again, I could put 1,000 on 1 week, and then right towards the end, I need to put 0 in, noting that I explicitly call out zeros where there's no submissions, which is an important thing. And then right towards the end, there's going to be another 500, for example. And then if I go back and just check my number for in sheet B, so it's 6,562. The 6,000, so I'm slightly over, 150 over. So I would just if I want to make that portfolio equivalent, I'll just remove whatever, that delta, and then that would give me, that makes those numbers match up. And that's what we would expect to see in that example. So that's the example of filling in the de minimis submission. And then I would wash, rinse, repeat for the next LDSO, the same process. And I'd start again and go through that same process. So hopefully that's clear. Are there any other questions?
No other questions at the moment, Alf.
Okay, that's great. So moving on to, and again, I don't think there's any difference between these other submissions to what we called out yesterday, but I will go over it again in case you weren't in that meeting. So the next one is the service provider sheet, and this is where we need to get a view, and we had this agreed at MWG, where we needed to get a view of the various service providers by LDSO that you're seeking to use, and within each of those LDSOs, what the approximate share by service provider type that you expect to have. So in this example, I'll fill in an advanced data service. So hang on. So let's have a look here. So this is just an example key lookup. So let's assume I have for this role ID, and this is the DIP role ID, for 4 advanced data service providers that I expect to be using. I may or may not know the MPID. So I could have ABC1. So that's one where I do know the MPID and we had this question yesterday, whether it's the qualifying MPID or the current MPID. Ideally, it's the qualifying MPID, but obviously if you don't have that, it's just whatever you have. And that allows us to identify this. So this is Advanced Energy Services 1, for instance. That's the name, and that's important for us to try and sort of aggregate under. And that we say as per the guide, we're saying this is an external data service provider, and then we give the share of the portfolio. So let me just kind of fill these ones in. So this is super service provider 1, next gen. I might be actually making up a real name, so apologies if I am. Data and something like another DS, right? And so one of these could be the internal one, so the in-house agent or service provider within that, and that's how you would flag that. And so there's the 4 advanced data service providers, of which we may have an MPID for only a couple of them, right? For example, and the other ones we'll just do our best to get some kind of referential integrity on that. And what we're looking for is, okay, what's the share? So we could assume under this one that 50% or 0.5 of this one is to the internal supplier, and the remaining is kind of almost evenly distributed between the others. So that would probably be something like, let's call it 15% for this one, 15% for this one, and then 20% for the final one. So obviously that gives me a total of 100% coverage across all of these for this particular service provider. And then equally, I'd want to see, is there what's the metering service advanced? Again, so this actually probably the one's probably more useful. Advanced metering service advanced. What's the coverage there? So we could actually have one there as that role. Is it not painting? I'll just type it in. So metering servicing advanced, and that just happens to be, again, that one, and it happens to be the same one. and we could just say that's doing the whole of that submission for that one. So, and once that's completed for EDLC for all the different various types, then we don't need the other ones. You just move on to the next LDSO. And then obviously when you finish, you can remove these final two columns because they're just examples. Just hide those for the moment. But if there's any, these are just for if there's any commentary that you need to provide. And this is for subsequent submissions if there's a change to these shares, and we can quickly identify those. So this is not used for this particular submission, but you may wish to put a comment on there.
Alf, we've had a few questions just submitted Slido. So Sarah's asked, we have a mix of envelopes and de minimis, and the envelopes have significantly smaller daily thresholds. Is there any negotiation on the envelope?
So I think we're aware that there's a couple of things that look odd at the boundaries of the parameters that we've set, and I think what I would call out is that we have, we have an initial view about what these initial set of parameters are in terms of the de minimis thresholds and so on and so forth. So I think it's not something we're going to be able to give an answer on now, but it's definitely something that we can take away, have a separate conversation about, and see whether those parameters need to be modified.
Okay, thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian.
And then Neil has asked whether we can provide a filled-in sample submission. So ideally, one example for a de minimis and then one sort of capacity envelope example as well.
A fully complete worked example for both. I mean, yeah, that's definitely doable. Of course, good idea, Ian. Neil.
Okay. And we also do obviously have the guidance document as well, don't we, Alf?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay. Was there anything else you wanted to cover, Alf, from a content perspective?
And it's just for those that didn't attend yesterday, there's the contact sheet. And that's just so as you're aware, you've probably already supplied contacts already, but if there's any change to that contact information, this is where you would provide it back to us. And all we've done here is actually broken it down to the supplier MPID level, just in case you have a different contact point down at the supplier MPID level, not just at the envelope level. And we'd ask you to fill in and update the contact, well, to change any demise any contacts, just say there's an end date and add a new row if there's a new primary contact. And that's how we'd ask you to do that. Okay.
Is it also worth flagging as well that obviously the team sent out all of the information to all suppliers that had provided both primary and deputy contacts to the PPC team. If you haven't received those, that will be because you haven't provided those contact details. And so we would just urge anyone who hasn't provided those details to provide those to us as soon as possible so we can get the information sent out to you.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Fran. I think, yeah, that's the content from my side for now.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Alf, and thanks, Ian. And there are no other questions in Slido at the moment. I don't know whether anyone has any sort of outstanding questions that they'd like to ask in the last 5 minutes. If not, just to flag again that we will be providing both the slides and the recording from today's webinar. Those will be uploaded to both the collaboration base and also the website. And then we will also provide an FAQ document with written responses to all of the questions that have been covered off in today's webinar, so in relation to the de minimis submissions, and then also in relation to the questions that were asked at yesterday's webinar, which focused on the capacity envelopes, and that will be made available next week at some point. Oh, there is a question that's just come in actually from Graham. So on the de minimis rules, is the 20 days to migrate the portfolio 20 consecutive days or just 20 days in total?
It's not. It's just any 20 days. It's a mechanism just to smear the distribution of the migration of the portfolio, so you can pick any 20 days in effect.
Brilliant, thanks, Ian. And then just to say as well that if you do have any questions that crop up whilst you're sort of digesting all of the information from the webinar both today and yesterday, and also just looking at the information that's been distributed to you all, then please feel free to email those into the migration team via the migration mailbox, and we'll pick those up and provide a response back to you. And I think that's everything.
Is it worth mentioning drop-in sessions?
Oh, yes, Ian. Yes,
Thanks.
definitely. And just to say as well that we have scheduled in a series of drop-in sessions. They kick off from next week, Monday. We've got one next Monday, the following Monday, then we've got the bank holiday, and we have a session the Monday after that. You should have all been invited to those. If you haven't been, please get in touch and we'll make sure that we invite you to those. And that will basically just be another opportunity for you to ask any specific questions of the migration team in relation to either your envelopes or your migration plans. So we can look to cover those off in those sessions. Okay, there are no other questions that have come through, so I think we can probably close this meeting out. But thank you all for attending. It's great to see so many of you dialed in today. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.